Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 5 Game of Thrones book characters that should have been in the show. This video is where I name my top 5 characters from the Song of Ice and Fire novels on which Game of Thrones is based that did not appear on the television series that I wish had. However, I'm pleased to announce that it won't just be me naming my top 5 characters, because Phil the Issues Guy will also be naming his 5 book characters that should have been in the show. So I want to say a huge thank you to Phil for being involved in this video, and if you haven't checked out his YouTube channel, I'd highly recommend you do so. I've been a fan of his channel for a while now, so I couldn't be more happy that he agreed to be involved in this video. So now we will both count down our top 5 book characters we wish were in the show, so I'll let Phil introduce himself.
Hi everybody, this is Phil the Issues Guy from Phil the Issues Guy's channel here on YouTube, or Phil's Recap and Review. I have to send a huge thank you to Mark from Enchantment of Eternity and all the viewers out there for having me over here to talk about my top 5 characters from the books that aren't included in the show. I have to admit, when Mark first asked me about this, my initial instinct was to pick characters that I didn't like the portrayal of in the show and be like, hey, I didn't like this Daario. I don't know who this Daario is, but he isn't the guy in the books. But I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to play that slippery slope. I'm going to stick by the rules, stick to the plan here, and give my top 5 list. So without any hesitation, here we go. Number 5 is Big Walda and Little Walda Frey. Now these two were members of the Frey family that were sent to Winterfell when Catelyn Stark and Robb Stark treated with the Freys to allow Robb's army to cross at the Twins. They were two of the young Freys that were to be fostered at Winterfell. What I really like about these characters and why I wish they were on the show is I feel like they are built in there for two really important reasons. One, for foreshadowing of how effed up the Freys are, because you get to see them at the foundation of childhood and hear a lot more about what Old Man Walder Frey does in his style of life. So if you read into it, you can see what is to come there. The other reason I really like it is because it gives Rickon a lot more to do, and we get a lot more attention on him and his perspective because he becomes close friends with these two and hangs out with them a lot. And then an accident happens with Shaggy Dog. I really enjoy all that part as development of both Shaggy Dog and Rickon and foreshadowing of the unfortunate events of the future. That's why I wish these two characters, at least on a small level, were included into the show.
Like Phil, I could also list off characters I think weren't handled well in the show, like Biter and Rorge, as in the novels they were badasses that ripped Brienne to shreds, whereas in the show they were just morons that stood there and let themselves be killed by Arya and the Hound. They completely ruined their characters. But, like Phil, I'll stick to the rules here and count down my top 5 characters who weren't in the show that I wish were, and I'll start off with my number 5, Cold Hands. I can kind of see why this character was cut, because I think the way they handled the scenes without him was fine, because it put the emphasis on Bran and Sam having to fend for themselves. But this is a really cool character, filled with lots of intrigue, and I do believe those who only watch the show and haven't read the books are missing out on something by not having him involved, because it opens up a whole slew of other questions by having someone who, by his own admission, is dead, being a character that actually supports our heroes. And this has yet to be explained, so it opens up a whole bunch of different possibilities and questions that, to me, make the story far more interesting. Plus, there's theories out there on who Cold Hands is. Is it Benjen Stark, or some other older former commander of the Night's Watch, or is it a rogue White Walker taken over by the magic of the Blood Raven? All these are very interesting questions, which I personally feel the show is lacking something by not having. And overall, I feel the show would have been enhanced had Cold Hands been involved.
Number 4 on my list is Lord Too Fat to Sit on a Horse, Waymond Manderley. Now, this is a character that there are rumors he is going to be included in Season 6 of Game of Thrones, but I feel like we've already missed out on not having him around. He is one of my favorite characters from the books, simply because of the way his character progresses through. He starts off, you meet him, his appearance, he's very large, someone that loved horses in the past, can't ride them anymore, and he's a loyal bannerman of House Stark that was there at the Battle of Trident fighting alongside Robert and Ned. But his storyline keeps progressing and becoming more and more interesting. He's constantly underestimated, looked at as a very large, craven individual, but has his own agenda and is always there to support House Stark, whether it be give an amazing speech about not being upset about dead Freys, whether it be bullshitting the Boltons about allegiance to them post the Red Wedding, trying to help out in the Theon situation by sending some men down to Sir Roderick Castle's army. He's always been loyal to House Stark. He's an extremely interesting character. Like I said, there are some rumors he may be included in Season 6 of Game of Thrones, but until then, until I see it on screen, he will remain as one of my favorite characters never to appear in the show.
My number 4 is also Waymond Manderley. Now, I assure you, Phil and I didn't pre-arrange this. I made my list several months ago, and Phil wasn't aware of my list when he made his. It just turns out that we both chose good old Waymond as number 4. Now, I agree with everything Phil said, but would also add that I felt the way he affected the story in Winterfell was sorely missed in Season 5. In the novels, you had a situation where Waymond went to Winterfell to show his support for the Boltons, but in secret was working against them and would outright feud with the Freys. The whole dynamic in Winterfell in Season 5 of the show I felt was severely lacking and didn't have the dynamic nor the tension that Waymond Manderley brought to the story in the novels. I think they had the opportunity to try something new, a variation of what happened in the books with Brienne, because Brienne was there in Winterfell and they could have had a storyline similar to the books with her taking the place of Mance Rayder and the Spearwives, and with the Waymond feuding with the Boltons and working to undermine them from within. But instead, they spent the whole time having Brienne just stand there in the snow, doing nothing, and not even seeing the frickin' candle that she was meant to see. Now, I know the rumors of him being in Season 6 that Phil speaks of, and from what I hear, it will just be one small scene where he speaks up in support of the Starks. And while it will be great to see him on screen, if, even just for a little while, I do believe he should have appeared in Season 5.
Number 3 on my list is a very interesting character that I really do wish was on the show, and that is Patchface. Now, Patchface is almost like a cross between Old Nan and Hodor, or it just has that kind of capability of a character, and I think could have possibly been just as popular as Hodor if was properly introduced. Now, Patchface is a jester that works in Stannis' court, has a rich history that is definitely worth checking out, but what really got me initially by the character was the audiobooks. Now, I was a big fan of the audiobooks for the most part. They have their issues with some of the name pronunciations and stuff like that, but for the most part, I really do love the audiobooks, and I love the actor that presents them. And he does Patchface. The voice is so haunting, supposed to be a jester, but has such a darkness and a mysticism, and almost you could consider a prophecy to the rhymes and to the things he says. And the way that the voice actor Roy Dotrice says it in the audio commentaries is just, for me, very effective in that particular character. Not every character works, not every pronunciation works, but that's one that works specifically for me, and it was a super memorable character. Now, Patchface has tattoos all over his face. He grew up as a slave in Volantis, and Lord Steffon Baratheon, the father of Stannis and Robert and Renly, bought him and thought that his kids would find him funny, specifically thinking Robert would be delighted by him. But unfortunately, on the way back, Lord Steffon Baratheon's ship got into a shipwreck, which unfortunately Stannis and Robert had to watch the whole thing. And 3 days later, Patchface washed up, and he became employed as the court fool and jester at Dragonstone. Ultimately, he spends most of his time with Shireen Baratheon, and she is extremely nice to him. Melisandre also talks to Jon Snow about seeing some darkness in him and having some problems with him. But all in all, just a character I really feel like we're missing out not having on the show.
My number 3 is somewhat of a minor character, but one whom I would call mysterious, and that is the Green Grace. The Green Grace is actually a title. There's one for every old Giscari city. However, this refers specifically to the Green Grace of Meereen, Gisela Galere, who appeared in A Dance with Dragons as she advised Daenerys on how best to rule Meereen. The Green Grace was a wise old character in her 80s that had the respect of everyone in Meereen. Dany valued her advice and seemed to take it to heart. In the novels, it was the Green Grace that advised Daenerys to marry Hizdahr rather than it simply being an idea that just came to Dany like it did in the show. While I could see why the show would want to cut her out, I do believe the show's portrayal of Meereen was somewhat lacking by not having many locals there to identify with other than Hizdahr zo Loraq. Now, in the novels, it has been hinted that there's a mysterious leader of the Sons of the Harpy known as the Harpy, whose identity is as yet unknown, and many, including myself, theorize that this person is in fact the Green Grace. Now, there's also the theory out there that Hizdahr zo Loraq is the Harpy, and that theory even existed in the show before he was killed. But I've never been a fan of that theory for either book nor show, as he generally felt like he was more invested in prospering under Daenerys, while as the Green Grace also seemed to have an ulterior motive, and to me, she didn't really seem all that sincere in her efforts to help Daenerys. To me, this was particularly apparent when Barristan Selmy was in charge of Meereen, and he sent her to negotiate with the Yunkish forces. She seemed to side with them and was urging that Barristan kill the dragons as the Yunkish demanded. Now, as far as the show, I personally don't believe there is a Harpy, and I don't think a leader of the Harpies will ever be named. I know it's a popular fan theory in the show that Daario is the Harpy, but personally I don't buy that for a second. Personally, I think part of the reason there is no Harpy in the show is because there is no Green Grace. And I think they're simply, bypassing that storyline altogether. Although I see their need to try to condense storylines such as hers, I really think she would have added something to the show and would have gone a long way to giving Meereen a bit more character. And if indeed she is the leader of the Sons of the Harpy, it would have given the Sons of the Harpy more of a face as well.
Number 2 on this list, and someone I have to include because it is really one of the most interesting, one of the most curious, question-asking driven characters in the books. That is, in fact, Cold Hands. Now, Cold Hands is something I feel like the show watchers really have missed out on because so many interesting questions arise from who is he, what kind of creature, what the hell is going on there. Now, Cold Hands kind of looks like a White Walker, but he speaks in a language that people can understand. At one point, he calls Sam brother, which really sparks off the imagination of who he could be. Is he connected to the Night's Watch somehow or something? And he follows Sam and Gilly on their storyline and kind of helps them out till eventually leaving them and going to help out Bran on his storyline and being Bran's protector. And that's one of the unfortunate things because we have the events, we have the things that happen in the book with Cold Hands involved. He's just omitted from the show. And it doesn't really fly for me when I think the reasoning behind it is because they didn't want to pay to put the character and make the character look cool. I've heard many times the excuse that they don't want to pay to put the direwolves on screen as much, and that bothers me. And in a way, I think they didn't omit Cold Hands because they felt he was unnecessary. They omitted him because they didn't want to pay to make the character look as cool as he needed to be and be on screen. I feel like they could have changed the game up a little bit and given us a little bit of Cold Hands, because I feel like just the inclusion of the character and, again, those questions that are asked just with his presence and how immensely awesome he looks on top of that elk and just everything. I feel like the show watchers only, that's one of the things that they really missed out on, is he's just such a cool character that to add to the pile of so many questions that Game of Thrones asks. So I feel like that's why he is so high on this list of characters that I love in the books that are not on the show.
My number 2 character that I wish were in the show is Leathers. Now, you may not at first recall who Leathers is, as he was a relatively minor character. However, he's mainly number 2 on my list, not because he himself was an overly interesting character, but mainly who he was that I found really interesting. And in short, Leathers is a wildling, or free folk as they would prefer to be called, who joined the Night's Watch. In the novels, he along with Jax are the first 2 wildlings to join the Night's Watch as part of Lord Commander Jon Snow's efforts to build a peace between the Night's Watch and the wildlings to take on the White Walkers. Leathers, Jax, and 4 other recruits were taken north of the Wall to swear their oaths in front of a heart tree where they discovered a group of wildling refugees, including the giant Wun-Wun. It was Leathers who calmed Wun-Wun down and convinced them to come back with them to Castle Black. There, Leathers served as Wun-Wun's interpreter and was said to be teaching Jon Snow some of the Old Tongue, and was also teaching Wun-Wun to speak the Common Tongue. Eventually, Jon Snow even went as far as to make Leathers his master-at-arms of Castle Black, over the objections of many others in the Night's Watch. Now, to me, having the wildlings integrate in the Night's Watch was a really fascinating scenario that the show really missed out on, and personally, I felt the whole Wall storyline in Season 5 was condensed far too much, and we missed out a lot of things. Not being able to see Jon truly shine as Lord Commander for long enough, not seeing Jon's plan to rebuild the castles along the Wall, which he used a lot of wildling laborers to help build. But most importantly, seeing the wildlings integrate into the Night's Watch, including Leathers, who became an official brother of the Night's Watch. And of course, this opens up some interesting questions going forward, such as how will the mutineers who are turning on the wildlings deal with Leathers and Jax, who have already joined the Night's Watch? Will they automatically consider their vows void, or will they ask them to turn on their wildling brothers? There are really fascinating storylines that the show missed out on because instead it chose to focus on a tired plot with an uninteresting character like Ollie, who was not at all interesting, and they proceeded to foreshadow to death that he was going to be one of Jon's stabbers, instead of focusing more on why he was being stabbed, such as the fact that he brought wildlings into the Night's Watch, such as Leathers. So in my opinion, the show would have been much more improved had they included Leathers.
Before I give my number 1 selection, there are a few characters that could have been in this top 5, but are kind of right on the cusp, or I go back and forth. They're in my top 10, but didn't quite poke into the top 5. And that is young Griff and Griff, also Lady Stoneheart, Penny. There are a couple of other characters here and there that possibly could have busted into this list that are interesting to me in the books that they didn't do in the shows, or they wrapped in a couple different characters into presenting that character, so it became that one character represents 3 characters per se, or something like certain characters were omitted to make another character seem tougher, or seem this, or seem that. But my number 1 character that was not included in the show that I loved in the books is none other than Strong Belwaz, the gigantic gladiator. I love this guy. He was one of my favorite characters in the books. I loved every moment with him, and I really could not wait to see how they put him in the show, and they ultimately did not, which really bummed me out in some weird way, just personally because I love this character so much. Now, he shows up with Artiston Whitebeard, Barristan Selmy, when he comes to save Daenerys, when he is introduced to Daenerys. He is with Selmy and is there also to protect Daenerys. Now, the show kind of kept the Selmy angle, didn't have him be in disguise because he was too visually represented. They had him come out of there, but Belwaz was not there. This giant pit fighter is just awesome fucking comic relief in that Daenerys storyline. He adds so much in so many little touches and elements that into Daenerys scenes that can usually drag sometimes. So ultimately, when they arrive to Meereen, when they send out the city champion to face off with the Khaleesi and all her champion, and in the show, they have it be Daario. But in the books, she doesn't want Daario because he's too pretty to go out there. She doesn't want Jorah because he's too important, and Barristan's too important. So they send strong Belwaz, which instead of taking a piss, he takes a shit. It's just amazing. He's just one of those characters that either he's sitting there and eating and hanging out and just being a really funny character, or he's making shit jokes and taking a shit. He's a hugely fun character for me because, I don't know, it's right there on my maturity level. Like I love this dude. I'd hang out with this guy. He'd be so freaking funny. Now, I can say I understand why the show didn't include him, because they felt like, oh, Daenerys was around so many different people to include another character. But I really feel like this kind of comic relief, this kind of character could really add to those scenes that we get sometimes with Daenerys that I'm not the biggest fan of. I know I could be alone in that, but I feel like her story became more interesting when Strong Belwaz showed up to me, and I look forward to every moment with him, and I feel like this was a really big one missing from the TV show for me, and my number one that I don't know how, I don't know why, but I still keep wanting them to include this character in. It's sad. It's a sad thing, but maybe they'll surprise us, and no, I don't think it's going to happen. I think if it was going to happen, it would have been last season when Jorah's in the fighting pits fighting in front of Daenerys. It would have been interesting if they put a little bit of a strong Belwaz thing. Some people claim that we did get one, but I don't consider that it. I want a real one. But ultimately, I've accepted it. It's a character that's not too important to the overall story or the grander story, but someone that is so fun to me and very much my number one missing character from the book to the show.
So now's the time for me to get to my number one. In like Phil, there were several characters I thought that should have been in the show, but they didn't quite make my top 5. I just want to give a quick mention of characters like Tom Seven Strings, Vargo Hoat, Cotter Pike, and Ariarne Martell. But now, let me get to my number one character from the novels that I wish was in the Game of Thrones television show, and this is another somewhat minor character that I have yet to hear anyone else mention that they thought should have been in the show or felt was missing from the show. So to my knowledge, I'll be the first one to mention this character as someone who should have been included in the show, and that is Taena Merryweather, also known as Taena of Myr. Now, Taena first appeared in The Storm of Swords, and to be perfectly honest, she didn't make that big of an impression on me in that book, and was mainly her involvement in the following book, A Feast for Crows, that I remember her most from. In that novel, she served as Cersei's most trusted confidant, who was aware and actively assisted in Cersei's scheming against the Tyrells. Taena even spied on Margaery for Cersei and reported back to her. Cersei assigned Taena's husband, Orton Merryweather, to the small council, and he even served a brief stint as Hand of the King. Now, the thing I find most interesting about Taena is that personally I question her loyalties. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a bunch of theories out there on whom she was really working for, and the most common one is probably Littlefinger. However, personally, I believe it's the Tyrells. Now, many would reject this notion because Taena seemed to participate in Margaery's arrest. But did she? Did she really? Or did she actually have a hand to play in Cersei's arrest? She was meant to be spying on Margaery for Cersei, but what if she was really just going to Lady Olenna and reporting back to Cersei whatever she wanted her to hear? In the show, Lady Olenna plots directly with Littlefinger to place Cersei's downfall in motion, but what if in the novels Lady Olenna plotted her downfall as well, but through Taena Merryweather? After all, Taena testified at Tyrion's Tyrell's trial, implicating him and using him as a scapegoat for Joffrey's murder was something that the Tyrells wanted. After Cersei was arrested, Taena and her husband fled King's Landing. Cersei was relieved because Taena could implicate her in the crimes that she committed, and I remember thinking to myself, Cersei, you fool. She fled because her job as a spy was done and she didn't want to expose herself. Now, I could be wrong, but I think it's interesting fodder to think about, something that the show missed out on. It would have been really interesting to see Cersei with an accomplice in her schemings, as in the book she had several, not only Taena but also the Kettleblacks. Although I wasn't that surprised nor disappointed that they weren't included in the show. I do think the show would have benefited from having a partner in crime for Cersei other than Qyburn, and the intrigue Taena brought, I thought, was something worth keeping. And of course, I had to mention that Taena and Cersei had a sexual relationship as well, but I assure you the reason I wanted her character included wasn't simply to see some hot girl-on-girl action, as I think there's enough of that in the show already. However, frankly, I'm surprised that HBO passed up on the opportunity. But the thing is, their sex scenes were really interesting not because they were hot, but specifically because they were not hot, as Cersei took absolutely no pleasure in them whatsoever and had a very dull attitude towards it, and it was obvious she was using sex as a political tool rather than actually deriving any pleasure from it, which I felt gave more dimension to later when she would do the Walk of Shame. She even noted at one time when Taena was asking for sex that she was just as bad as a man. So I felt it was a great character exploration of Cersei that added depth to her character and something that the show missed out on. Overall, making Taena Merryweather my #1 character from the novels I wish were in the show. So that's it for our top 5 Game of Thrones characters from the novels that should have been in the show. But before I go, another quick word from Phil.
Thank you, Mark. Huge thank you to you for having me over here. And if you want to check out any more of my stuff, come on over to Phil the Issues Guy here on YouTube, Phil's Recap and Review, where we do post-episode recaps of some of our favorite programs, including Game of Thrones, some shorter theory-type videos as well, and lots of silly fun. So if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Huge thank you to Mark for having me over here and all the viewers for checking this out. So I will talk to you guys next time.
And I just want to say thanks again to Phil for collaborating with me on this video. So great to add another perspective to this video. And yes, please do make sure to check out Phil's channel and subscribe. There's a lot of awesome content coming out of there. And be sure to check out my channel as well, as I try to do at least one Game of Thrones video a week, as well as covering a lot of other TV shows currently airing. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.